They didn't just disapprove, they disowned, politely and with silver-plated cruelty, so I left Charleston. I found a half-collapsed container on the edge of an abandoned soybean field in Nebraska, paid 3 months' rent in advance, and moved in with nothing but my laptop, a thrift store mattress, and a head full of designs no one believed in.
Hey, that's where True Harvest was born. At first, it wasn't even a company, just a late-night ritual. Me, a blinking cursor, and the sound of prairie wind moaning through rusted metal. I coded until sunrise, fueled by gas station coffee and ramen noodles. I could hear my scratching under the plywood floor.
My prototype soil sensors shorted out so many times, I thought maybe my family was right, that I was playing pretend with dirt. Then I met Naomi. She'd read one of my posts on an obscure agritech forum and sent me a handwritten letter, a real one. It said, I used to calibrate flight systems for NASA, but I've been dreaming about earthbound miracles lately. Do you need someone else who's just crazy enough to believe in this? Asterisk. She quit her job 2 weeks later and drove her rust-colored Prius across 3 states to join me. We built the first field-ready version of True Harvest in a borrowed shed with one truck and no budget. We tested it ourselves. Sometimes it failed, sometimes it sparked, but sometimes it worked. In a family that worshipped courtrooms, I chose to plant roots in dirt, and though they all believed I'd rot there, something unexpected began to grow. They thought I'd burn out under Nebraska skies. They didn't expect the fire would grow roots. Naomi and I didn't just build a company, we built from dust. In the early days, True Harvest was held together with duct tape, adrenaline, and a shared refusal to give up. We worked out of a repurposed grain shed with spotty Wi-Fi and 3 folding chairs, tinkering until our fingers were numb from cold and cold. Our first real invention was True Sense, a small rugged sensor you could stake directly into the soil. It measured heat, moisture, and nutrient levels, then sent real-time data to a mobile dashboard we hacked together over ramen and dialed coffee. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Barely. We pitched the prototype to 17 investors. Most smiled politely, told us it was inspiring, and ghosted us by morning. One even said, it's cute what you're trying to do, but farmers don't use apps. The 18th meeting was in a borrowed storage unit we converted into a demo room. No slides, no polished pitch deck, just Naomi, me, and 2 buckets of dirt. A woman named Rachel, an angel investor who'd built her own logistics company from the back of a minivan, sat cross-legged on a folding chair, watched the dashboard light up in real time, and asked 2 questions. Can it scale, and do you eat lunch? I said yes and no. She laughed and signed a $50,000 seed check on the spot. That first check didn't buy luxury, it bought time, enough to keep the lights on, enough to crash less often. We drove to a struggling farm outside Karini and asked to run a pilot. The farmer looked skeptical, but agreed. 3 months later, that same farm saw a 30% yield increase after a brutal drought. The data stunned even us. The farmer's wife hugged me outside the barn, eyes wet with relief. My daughter, she whispered, gets to stay in school because of you. I stood there stunned, hands still stained from dust and wire, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Certainty. Naomi brought a rice cooker to the office the week after that. I hadn't eaten a real meal in 7 days, just snacks, caffeine, and stubbornness. She made jasmine rice and scrambled eggs, then threatened to unplug the server if I didn't take a break. That's how we worked. Part engineers, part paramedics, part lunatics with a vision. We slept on yoga mats, held planning meetings in gas station parking lots, and once duct-taped a busted sensor to a tractor axle just to see if it could withstand vibration. Sometimes we failed gloriously, but slowly True Harvest stopped being a dream. It became real. I never told my family. I blocked their emails, muted their numbers, and never once shared the Agritech Weekly article that called us the quiet revolution beneath America's farms. It wasn't bitterness. It was self-preservation. I wasn't ready for their noise to round out my signal again. Then came the Regional AgTech Summit. I almost didn't go. I had mud on my boots and 2 broken fingernails, but Rachel insisted. I stood on stage next to Naomi in front of a room full of suits, holding up a clump of Nebraska soil like it was gold. My voice shook at first, then it didn't. The audience leaned in.
Afterward, a man approached me, older, sharp eyes, linen blazer. You're Harold Warner's daughter, aren't you? My spine stiffened, but he smiled kindly and said, I taught your father torts. He thought success wore a suit. You wear dust, but dust makes things grow.
Oh, something cracked open inside me. I wasn't just running from my family anymore. I was running towards something, toward a version of the world where soil and data held more promise than verdicts and applause, where growth wasn't just vertical but rooted, stubborn, patient, and maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the black sheep anymore. I was the seed. The envelope smelled like the past. Expensive stationery, embossed gold ink, and a name I hadn't said out loud in 5 years. Warner. I found it tucked beneath a stack of invoices in the mailbox outside our office. Its surface stiff with formality. The ink glinted under the pale Nebraska sun. Catherine Warner. My mother had written every letter of my name in looping cursive, Delilah Grace Warner, as if by dressing it up in elegance, she could erase the years of silence. The letter inside was even more theatrical. You are cordially invited to the Warner Family New Year's Gala. This year's celebration will include honored guests from the Charleston Herald and the Warner Trust Board.
We hope you are ready to reconnect. That last line felt like a dare.
Naomi glanced at the invitation, then it hit me. You're not actually considering this, right? I didn't answer at first. My hands were still holding the letter as if it might burn through my palm. I could still hear my mother's voice the day I left Charleston, trembling and embarrassed in front of guests. She's lost her mind. She's being poisoned by some activist fantasy. That memory sat in my throat like unswallowed food. I'm not going because I need them, I finally said. I'm going because they need to see what I've become with their own eyes. Naomi folded her arms. Then don't go dressed like a billionaire. I won't. I booked a flight and rented an old pickup that still smelled faintly of motor oil and sun-dried vinyl. My outfit was deliberate, a muted cotton dress in the color of tilled soil, scuffed boots, no jewelry except the battered Casio watch I'd worn through Nebraska winters. Swept my hair into a low bun and wore no makeup. If they were expecting a red carpet arrival, I was determined to give them rust and roots. Before heading to the family estate, I took a detour past the corner of Meeting and Broad, where Warner and Sons law firm towered in brick and pride. A freshly printed billboard loomed above the street, featuring my brother Daniel in a tailored navy suit, arms folded beside our father, who still held his signature courtroom stare. I used to dream of standing between them, my own name etched below in gold. Now, I pulled to the curb, rolled down the window, and stared up at the sign until the wind picked up a curl of my hair and flung it across my face. That was never my name anyway, I said quietly. Back at the motel, Naomi paced to the floor while I dialed. Yes, I'd like to confirm the January 2nd press briefing with USDA and Walmart. I told the coordinator. Location secure? Perfect. Please make sure it goes live immediately after. When I hung up, Naomi tilted her head. You really want to spring it on like that?
They think I'm coming back with hat in hand.
I want them to see the fire I built from the ashes.
She didn't argue.
She just handed me the burner phone we used for press coordination and muttered, then let it burn clean.
I stood in front of the mirror later that night and studied the person they'd cast out. Sun-browned skin, faint lines etched near the eyes from squinting in light and stress. Hands calloused from code and harvest, not courtroom pens.
But there was a stillness in me that hadn't existed 5 years ago, a groundedness I'd earned in the windstorms of failure and the silence of doubt. I thought about that line in the letter again. We hope you are ready. I was. Just not in the way they expected. I wasn't going home to seek forgiveness. I was bringing the weight of everything they thought I couldn't carry. I arrived 15 minutes early, but somehow I still felt like I was already too late for their approval, their pride, their love. Maybe I'd stopped arriving in their world the day I walked out of Yale. The Warner estate looked just as I remembered it, gilded chandeliers glowing like judgmental eyes, marble floors that echoed footsteps like gongs of tradition. A house where silence meant more than words and everything unspoken screamed louder than what was said.
I stepped through the double doors, half expecting someone to reach out with open arms. No one did. The cousin I barely recognized whispered behind her champagne flute. She really came.
My mother, poised in a lavender silk, glanced down at my rough cotton dress and murmured to her best friend. At least she didn't wear boots this time. I kept walking. Derry back, past the oil portraits of ancestors who'd founded courts and councils, not companies. Past the ballroom, where Abigail had her sweet 16 with a live string quartet. Past the library where I once cried into my textbooks the night I realized I didn't want their path. The dining room doors opened like theater curtains. The table was long, silver polished, immaculately set. The air smelled like rosemary and restraint. Wine was poured, Bordeaux, of course. Father stood and raised his glass with the same practiced authority that once earned him headlines as the judge with an iron spine. This year, he began, was another triumph for the Warner name. One son defending justice, one daughter stepping into public service, another generation rising strong. A pause followed, 2 rehearsals to be real. Daniel launched into a retelling of his federal case, something about a major drug bust and a judge's commendation. Abigail, all sparkles and strategically modest smiles, announced her engagement to a rising state senator. He says I'll make a better first lady than lawyer, she giggled. I said, why not both? Laughter rippled like ripples from a stone skipping over water. But when it came time for others to share updates, no one said my name. And Uncle chuckled. What was it again? Delilah's doing. Techie farming, right? Before I could answer, my mother cut in with a patronizing smile. Delilah's exploring self-discovery in the Midwest. We've always encouraged individuality. The words hit like ice down my back. I glanced across the table. My father sipped his wine, his fingers clenched around the stem, like he might crush it. The same hands that signed the... I considered speaking. Just a little, just enough, maybe about the prototype we just scaled for national use, or the USDA pilot project, or the fact that Walmart's agriculture division had just flown a team out in Nebraska. But I stopped myself. Not yet. Let them speak first. Daniel leaned in close during the soup course, the scent of cedar cologne clinging to him like performance. If you come back, he whispered, join my firm as a legal consultant. Dad might let this whole phase go.
I smiled slow and steady. The kind that made people lean in before they realized they were the ones being watched. I didn't answer. Dessert arrived. Miniature chocolate soufflés, plated like status symbols.
Abigail raised her glass to toast the future of our family legacy. I lifted mine too, though I couldn't help but feel the disconnect. Around this table sat people who had inherited podiums and thought they had earned microphones. They traded stories like currency, but none of them asked about the dirt beneath my nails. The table was filled with people who'd been handed everything and thought they'd earned it. I was the only one who'd built something no one could see. Yet, when the knives stopped cutting duck, they started cutting bloodlines. The main course had just been served, roasted duck à l'orange with microgreens and fig glaze, when my father stood the dining room. Moments earlier, full of links and murmurs, dropped into immediate silence. All heads turned toward him, some with indifference, others with something closer to anticipation. He lifted his wine glass with the solemnity of a judge about to pronounce a final verdict. This year, he said, his voice sharp as crystal, we've decided to take a necessary step to preserve the values of the death. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know how deep it would cut. Delilah, he continued, will no longer be included in any financial, legal, or inheritance structures affiliated with the Warner family. She has of her own volition chosen a different path.
There it was! The public execution of my name!
A few relatives nodded with restrained approval. One of my father's law partners even offered a light, polite clap, as if we were at a retirement party and I'd just been handed a plaque. My mother didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, lips pursed, as though this had been scheduled months in advance, and slotted neatly between golf and her weekly salon. I sat still. On the outside, I was composed, still cutting the duck with deliberate precision. On the inside, a storm rose, a quiet, roaring storm, not of shame, but clarity. They didn't know they were cutting someone off who no longer needed to be attached. I'd already built something far more rooted than their wine-soaked tradition. Before I could respond, Abigail chimed in, her voice dripping sugar and venom. It's really brave of you, pretending that KO can change the world. I looked at her, at the gleam of her senator fiancé's diamond on her finger, at the perfectly curled hair that had never known dirt, and I almost laughed. Almost. My phone vibrated in my pocket once, twice, 3 times. I knew that rhythm. Emergency. Naomi. Excuse me, I said, rising from my chair with practiced grace. All eyes turned toward me, irritation simmering just beneath the silverware. My father arched a brow. Start-up drama, I suppose, he said, half to the room, half to himself. I stepped out onto the side veranda. The December air cool against my skin. I picked up the call. Naomi, I said. Her voice was breathless, charged. They signed. Walmart and USDA. It's done. $70 million. Valuation just jumped to 185.
Forbes wants an exclusive. They want you in DC tomorrow.
They didn't say anything for a second. Just looked up at the Charleston stars.
I'd once thought I'd never see again.
I'm on my way back to the table, I said.
I stepped inside, the soft hum of the dining room returning like white noise. I took my seat slowly. Every eye followed me. I could feel the expectation, a flinch, a retreat, a surrender. I gave them none of it. I apologized for taking a call during dinner.
I said calmly, lifting my wine glass. But it seems my little kale hobby just fed a nation. Silence, heavy and absolute. No one moved. No one reached for dessert. My mother's spoon slipped from her hand and landed on the china with a sharp clink. My father cleared his throat, but nothing came out. Abigail's smile froze, eyes flickering in real-time calculation.
I set my glass down, untouched. They thought they'd cut me off, but I was never plugged into them to begin with. The silence after that dinner didn't last long. Within 72 hours, my name was in the headlines, but not the ones I wanted. The first article dropped like a guillotine blade, landing on the homepage of a legal analysis site with the subtlety of a bomb. Startup founder linked to ethics breach inside USDA bid. They used my photo from a speaking event in Omaha, cropped tight around my face as if to say, this is the face of scandal. The piece cited anonymous federal sources suggesting True Harvest may have engaged in improper political relationships with USDA officials. The subtext wasn't subtle. It implied the $70 million contract had been secured not through merit, but manipulation. A name I'd built from Alaska soil was now being dragged through Washington mud. Naomi burst into my office that morning, jaw clenched, eyes on fire. I traced the leak, she said, slapping a printed page on the desk. The insider source, federal legal advisor DW, that's Daniel Warner, I didn't speak, couldn't. I just stared at the name on the page, bold and clinical. Not even his full name, just initials, but I recognized the knife. My family hadn't just cut me out. They were coming back with blades to make sure I bled. As if that weren't enough, within hours, Midogri, a multi-billion-dollar agrotech firm and the largest player in the Midwest, filed a lawsuit against True Harvest. They claimed we'd violated their intellectual property, alleging our moisture sensors bore similarities to a prototype they'd shelved years ago. By nightfall, my phone was full of missed calls, investors, journalists, board advisors. Everyone wanted answers, assurances, a clean explanation. But all I had was a storm brewing in my chest. USDA issued a temporary suspension of the announcement, citing the need for internal review. Forbes, who had scheduled a full-page profile, pulled the piece. I became the tech world's latest cautionary tale, the farm girl who flew too close to DC. One outlet dubbed me tech heiress, who may have lied her way into a government deal. I sat alone in our office that night. The fluorescent lights flickering softly above me, the contract still lay on my desk, official and binding. But somehow, it felt fragile now, like paper soaked in gasoline, waiting for the match. Naomi stood in the doorway holding 2 mugs of burnt coffee. "We fight," she said. I looked up at her, then down at the contract again. "They're trying to erase the road I built," I said. "I'm going to make sure they see every footprint I ever left behind, grown over with green, and we gotta work."
We gathered data, hard undeniable numbers. True Harvest pilot program had already been implemented in 100 farms across 7 states.
We compiled reports, 41% average increase in revenue, 33% reduction in food waste, 128 new rural jobs created. We detailed every innovation, every yield improvement, every dollar saved. I didn't send it to lawyers, I sent it to farmers, to nonprofit food access programs, to sustainability coalitions. I emailed the report to every journalist who had ever published a piece on agrotech, including the ones who doubted us. Forbes got it. So did the New York Times. I included letters from farmers whose land we had helped salvage. A video of a teenage girl in Kansas saying my dad didn't have to sell the farm. He's still here because of True Harvest. We didn't spin. We didn't threaten. We told the truth. Loud and with open hands.
2 days later, my phone rang. "This is Mitchell from USDA," the voice said, steady and firm. "We're reinstating the contract. Your data speaks for itself. We trust farmers more than whispers." I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I just whispered thank you and hung up. Then I turned to Naomi and said, "Book the interview." Every outlet that passed on us, now they'll have to listen.
That night, as I stood on our rooftop beneath a sky bigger than any courtroom, I felt it settle inside me, not just relief, but resolve. I didn't build this company to prove anything to them, but if they want war, then let them see what a woman who works the soil can do. My brother was never the villain in our family stories. He was the legacy, the polished one, the prodigy. But legacies can rot too, if no one dares to lift the mask. When I walked into the courthouse that morning, the air tasted like metal, sterile, clinical, rehearsed. Daniel had filed a civil action against True Harvest, claiming I'd misused sensitive government data I supposedly had access to only because of our family name. The implication was clear: nepotism disguised as innovation. The courtroom wasn't packed, but the weight in the air felt heavy enough to crush. Naomi sat beside me, her laptop open, her fingers still a stone. My heart thudded like boots on hardwood. Daniel sat across the aisle in a tailored navy suit, hair perfectly combed, flanked by mid-age attorneys. When he stood to speak, he didn't even look at me. Your Honor, this case is not about business rivalry. It's about ethical responsibility. The defendant leveraged family ties to infiltrate a federal agency and secure a contract she was never meant to touch. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream, but I stayed still. Later in the hallway during recess, Daniel approached me, his smile tight and hollow. You've embarrassed the family enough. Walk away now. You'll still get a seat at the table, just not at the head.
I looked him dead in the eye. The table is too small for what I'm building. Naomi didn't wait.
She sent it, the audio file we'd been holding, a private call recorded weeks earlier between Daniel and Nita Gray's chief counsel. She's a walking liability, Daniel said on the tape. Once we discredit her with USDA, we can scoop the tech for pennies. The air left the courtroom when the file played. Audible gasps, whispered curses. Even the judge paused as if trying to collect the gravity of what she just heard. We didn't wait for the media spin. That night, I called a press conference. Naomi booked a warehouse we'd used back when True Harvest was just 2 laptops and a box fan. No podium, no teleprompter, just me standing under rested beams, facing a sea of cameras and callous hands. This isn't about startup politics. I began, my voice steady but not rehearsed. It's about who gets to define worth. I will not be erased because my story doesn't fit someone else's pedigree. In the crowd, a man held up a cardboard sign. She saved our land when no one else cared. It was Mr. William, one of our earliest farmers. I nearly broke then. After the speech, I sat on the loading dock, letting the cold concrete steady me. My phone buzzed. For the first time since that cursed New Year's dinner, my mother's name appeared on the screen. Your father thinks he may have been a bit harsh, she said. But I stared at the horizon. A bit harsh as cutting a wedding cake with a dull knife. I said, you cut your daughter out of the family with precision. That night, in the office I'd built from Nebraska's steel and late-night ramen, I looked out through the glass walls of our 12th floor suite. They tried to bury me, but they forgot. I'm the one who plants. I wasn't afraid of the courtroom. I'd lived in its shadow all my life. What terrified me was becoming the kind of person who fought to win, not to be heard. The civil hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. The Charleston courthouse lobby was buzzing, reporters with cameras, farmers in flannel shirts sitting beside investors in tailored suits, USDA reps in modest gray blazers, trying to remain neutral. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a wall of mid-aged lawyers. His face was calm, too calm, as if this was the final checkmate move in a game. He believed I hadn't even realized we were playing. His opening argument was precise, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. Ms. Warner used familial proximity to gain access to government contacts and privileged information, insight that unfairly secured a federal contract worth $70 million. I felt a flicker of heat rise in my chest, but I didn't flinch. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, a sheath of notes in my hand I never once looked at. True Harvest was built in a shipping container with a half-broken fan and a bucket of dirt. I said, we pitched to 17 investors. 16 said no. Our tech has been tested across droughts, floods, and bureaucracy. We didn't ask for favors. We begged for chances, and we earned every inch of them. When the screen behind me lit up with the image of one of our earliest fields, sodden, half-rotted from flash flooding, I felt my throat catch. I remembered the night I spent bailing water with my bare hands, trying to save our sensors from drowning. Then Naomi stood and called her surprise witness, Mr. Nelson, a retired USDA engineer. He took the stand in a faded corduroy blazer, slow but certain in speech. I've worked with Midagri. I refused to sign a deal with them years ago because they tried to bury data showing environmental damage. True Harvest, they just worked. They asked the right questions. They earned trust the old-fashioned way by showing up. The room shifted. The momentum shifted. But the final blow came when our legal counsel introduced a second audio clip, one no one but Naomi and I knew we had. In the clip, Daniel and Midagri's CEO discuss manipulating media narratives to crush us, frame it as a question of ethics. Daniel said, "People love a scandal more than they love facts." I didn't look at my family as it played, but I felt it, the room freezing over. My father's sharp inhale, a mother's hand clutching her coat, Abigail slipping quietly out the side door. When the judge returned, her ruling was swift and clear. There is no admissible evidence supporting a claim of ethical or legal violation by True Harvest. The case is dismissed with prejudice. A few seats clapped, then more and more. It wasn't Wall Street types or Midagri shareholders. It was farmers in beat-up boots and wives who ran farm books at kitchen tables. The applause wasn't loud, but it was honest. As I turned to leave the courtroom, I glanced back at Daniel. He looked smaller somehow, not defeated, just hollow, like a statue that had finally been seen as clay. Outside, the sun broke clean across the courthouse steps. I let it touch my skin. And for the first time since those early mornings in Nebraska, I cried, not for loss, not for pain, but because I had lived through the fire and planted something anyway. They didn't apologize, not really, but maybe that's not the point. Sometimes the ones who break you don't know how to ask for glue. A week after the verdict, I returned to Nebraska. The team at True Harvest had planned a small celebration, a quiet gathering in the field house with cake and streamers. Naomi had clearly forced someone to buy. Laughter floated between toasts and jokes about farmer fashion becoming trendy, but I just sat near the window staring out at the acres of green we'd fought to keep. My champagne stayed untouched. That night, I found a letter slipped between the pages of a quarterly report, not an email, not a text. A letter on pale cream stationery I hadn't seen since childhood. Warner family crest embossed in the corner, now slightly faded. The handwriting was my mother's, slanted, hesitant, unusually shaky. Delilah, it began.
I don't know how to apologize for being silent for so long. I was afraid you wouldn't like us, but I was wrong. You are the braver version of everything we hope to be. Love, Mom? I read it 3 times, each time slower, and still, the tears didn't come. Not yet.
4 days later, I agreed to meet her.
A riverside cafe in Charleston, halfway between our world and theirs. She was already seated when I arrived, stirring her tea like it might spill a truth if she let it settle too long. Her hair was grayer than I remembered. Her coat, a little too elegant for a Tuesday. We didn't talk about the lawsuit or the newspaper headlines. We talked about sunflowers. When you were 8, she said, smiling faintly, you planted that sunflower by the mailbox. Daniel ripped it out because it wasn't in the approved landscaping zone. She shook her head. We didn't know how to love what didn't look like us.
I watched her for a moment, not as a mother, not as the woman who once nodded when I was cut from the family trust, but just as a woman, trying. I didn't say I forgave her, but I reached across the table, let my hand rest over hers. It was enough.
Then came the question I hadn't expected. Your father. He wants to visit Nebraska. He says he'd like to see what you've built. I didn't answer. I just looked back toward the river. The current, slow, steady, indifferent. Maybe he would come, maybe he wouldn't, but I thought, maybe I could show him, even if he never says thank you. Later that week, I stood on the balcony of True Harvest, watching a school group tour the grounds. One girl, maybe 9 or 10, looked up at me wide-eyed. Are you the inventor? She asked.
I smiled. No, I just plant the questions that turn into answers. I used to think healing meant they'd change. Now I know healing means I can live, even if they don't.
They once called me the girl who walked away from power, but I didn't walk away. I just planted mine somewhere they couldn't see it grow. 1 year after the trial, True Harvest had grown roots deeper than any projection model had guessed. We weren't just surviving. We were seeding change in places that had never been mapped in corporate forecasts. We expanded into international soil, forming partnerships with local farming initiatives in Kenya, Vietnam, and Bolivia. In California, we launched a new pilot site that fused smart agriculture with rural STEM education. Every child who visited left with dirt on their hands and curiosity in their pockets. But the thing that mattered most to me wasn't on any investor call sheet. We launched the Harvest Without Permission Scholarship Fund. It was for girls from nowhere. Girls who had been told they were too loud, too brown, too poor, too stubborn, too much. Girls who had never seen a lab coat in their town, let alone worn one.
Old Scholarship was named after a native crop. Cassia, maize, jasmine, bamboo, resilient, stubborn, and uniquely their own. My first TED Talk happened that fall under Warm Lights and Global Eyes. The title, What Grows When You Don't Ask Permission.
I ended with this. They told me legacy comes in surnames and courtrooms, but I found mine in fields, algorithms, and the hands of people who'd been forgotten.
We hosted an annual showcase at True Harvest HQ. This time, I didn't need to scan the room to feel the difference. My parents were there, even Abigail. They sat quietly in the middle row. No name tags, no fanfare, just present. Daniel wasn't there. I didn't ask why. I didn't speak about the past that night. I talked about future. I introduced a 12-year-old girl from Mississippi, winner of our first Harvest Without Permission award. She told me, I want to build a machine that makes rain for my grandma's farm. I told her, I'll help you. Later that night, long after the lights dimmed and the applause faded, I found myself standing in front of the container that started it all. It was no longer a lab or an office, but a quiet archive of memory. Inside, on the top shelf behind old solar panels, I found the notebook, the very first one. My messy handwriting scrawled across the pages, moisture, Sunday, yield, hope. I stepped outside and walked to the tree out back, the one I planted on my first night in Nebraska, now tall enough to shade a truck. I dug a small hole beneath its roots and placed the notebook inside. No ceremony, no camera, just soil and silence. I no longer need their permission to exist. I just need space to grow. And I've built that root by root until even the wind knows my name. Sometimes the people who doubt us become the soil where our strength takes root, and the silence we once feared becomes the space where our voice grows loudest. We don't need permission to rise. We only need truth, courage, and the quiet power of persistence. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please follow, like, and subscribe.
Thank you for listening.